Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So much to ask you, Kevin, and thank you for being here and for your willingness to step up and serve in this capacity. On the tax bill, I know you talked a little about that in the economic report and your projections on growth. Two questions. One, there's concern about the deficit that might be created. And we had to use, as you know, an economic growth number of 1.9%. That's the Congressional Budget Office official average over the next 10 years. And the one way to look at it is to say if you had 0.4% more growth than the 1.9%, then you'd have enough revenue coming in because you get about $2.7 trillion for every 1 point of economic growth. What's your projection on economic growth and specifically, and then more generally, how do you think the tax bill will end up in terms of its impact on the deficit?
Well, thank you, Senator, and thank you also for agreeing to introduce me at my confirmation hearing. It seems like a long time ago, but that was very gracious of you. I think that you were right to think about it, that if you go out to the 10th year and we have on the baseline a $28 trillion economy, that if you imagine a growth of 0.5% a year higher or 1% a year higher, if you like to divide by 10, then you can see that it's very easy to envision this tax bill generating enough growth so that it doesn't have a negative effect on revenue. I think that the Joint Tax Committee gave a dynamic score of $1 trillion, but I think that they really underestimated the growth effect. I think that if we get the growth that we project in the economic report and the president, and again, and I think in a very transparent way, then that will add almost $3 trillion to baseline level of GDP at the end, and that's, you know, American money, and some of it can be paid back in taxes, but all of it will contribute to welfare of American citizens.
Which means the pro-growth tax reform will actually end up reducing the deficit relative to what it would have been. And with regard to what is most important in the tax bill, you talk about productivity. When I talk to companies back home, of course, we're talking about bonuses and pay increases and contributions to 401ks, which is great. And of course, individuals are getting more tax relief, and withholding tables have been changed. People are finding, you know, 40, 50 bucks in their paycheck they didn't expect. But what's the most important single thing in this tax bill for long-term growth and wages?
The most important single thing in this tax bill for long-term growth and wages is to make the corporate rate 21%, because we've ended the kind of scam, the tax scam, where you could get a tax refund to locate a factory offshore and to increase demand for foreign workers and reduce demand for domestic workers. We've fixed that really heinous policy error, and the signs of its damage to the economy are all around us and all throughout this economic report. Again, think about it. Capital formation's contribution to productivity growth went negative for the first time in U.S. history at a time when we weren't in a recession, because we were chasing all of our capital offshore, and I think that we fixed that.
Yeah, and that will result in more investment, which results in higher productivity, which results in higher wages, and to me, that's the most exciting part of this bill, and we have yet to see all the benefits of that, and won't for many years, but it ultimately will make the biggest difference for my constituents, I believe. With regard to opioids, we've talked a lot about it today. I focused a lot on this notion that we don't really have 4.1% unemployment, as good as that sounds. We'll know what the new numbers are on Friday, and they're probably going to be good for the month of February again. We're seeing good economic growth, but if you go back to the labor force participation rate before the Great Recession, the unemployment number today would be 8.9%. Sure. Think about that. People are shocked to think about, really, we're living in kind of a 9% unemployment environment, even though we say it's closer to 4%. And who are these people who are outside of the workforce? And when you do those studies, as you know, you find out that opioids play an amazingly large role. And I appreciate your raising that issue. And the Brookings study by your colleague, Mr. Kruger, is one, of course, but also BLS has its own study out there. It's very similar, saying that roughly 43 to 47% of men who are currently of prime working age, able-bodied men, are taking pain medication on a daily basis. And his conclusion is that about 31% of those people who are out of the workforce is directly related to opioids, based on his further questions on whether it's a prescription drug or not. This is shocking to people, and we look at the economic impact in many ways, but one we have to look at is this lack of opportunity for access to a workforce that we desperately need. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with that. And you mentioned or Alan Kruger, who was my predecessor as the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. I've spoken at length with Dr. Kruger, Professor Kruger, about his study. It's filled with really interesting food for thought and helpful insights that will help us address this problem as we move forward. And so I think you're right to mention that work. It's extremely important work, very well done. And I've spoken with Dr. Kruger about it.
I hope it encourages us to do even more on the opioid crisis. We've got the funding now. We've got to be sure it's well spent with CARE 2.0. My colleague who talked earlier is a co-sponsor of that. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Hassett.